Hello and welcome to the first review of Request Month 2022. This is Bright Memory Infinite for PC, Xbox One, and Xbox Series S and X, although I don't believe the Xbox versions are out yet. What you're seeing here is the PC version, and it was sent to me by Yoda for reviewing, so thank you for that, it is greatly appreciated. This is a first-person shooter mixed with cinematic action, hack-and-slash kinda stuff, developed by FYQD Personal Studio and published by Playism in November of last year. And this is basically the full game version of what was more or less a proof of concept in the original Bright Memory, now I believe referred to as Bright Memory Episode 1. If you're curious what I had to say about the original Bright Memory, I did cover that in a multi-game MTO titled For a Few FPS's More, and I'll have a link to that in the video description box. More specifically, it'll be time-coded so that when you click on the link, it should take you right to the point in the video where I talk about Bright Memory. And while knowledge of what was going on in the original Bright Memory is not really required for Bright Memory Infinite, considering the original was a proof of concept demo for what this ultimately became, you might still find it interesting to go and watch the Bright Memory segment of that particular video to see what the proof of concept demo was like before going any further in this particular review. But what about Infinite itself? How did they translate some of the ideas from the proof of concept demo into a full game? And how is this in general as a fusion of the first-person shooter and cinematic hack-and-slash action genres, which, if you're not familiar with, refers to games like Devil May Cry and such? Well, let's just go ahead and start delving right into it and find out. And like always, we'll go ahead and start with the presentation, which runs on Unreal Engine 4, and for a very small studio, as far as I'm aware, it's still only one guy developing almost the entirety of the game. It's a pretty impressive effort. It's got excellent texture quality, the modeling is generally very well done, although there are a few odd edges here and there, and the character and weapon handling animations are all rather solid. It also has a lot of very well done post-processing effects, water effects, and particle effects, all of which make this a very impressive game to look at. But they do also result in it being pretty difficult to tell what's going on a lot of the time. So it seems that in the pursuit of visual fidelity and impressive graphics, they sacrificed playability, which is something you should never, under any circumstances, do. But weirdly enough, they didn't sacrifice playability in terms of frame rate, because even though the game does look very good from a visual perspective, and even though that does interfere with your ability to play it just by obscuring things so much, it runs extremely well. We're talking well over 100 frames per second at nearly all times on my system, and I'm not running the top-of-the-line hardware anymore. I've got an i7 4790K, 16 gigs of RAM, and a GTX 1080. And despite this game being made with RTX cards in mind, because ray tracing is actually a major part of the visuals if you have that ability, this thing still runs at well over 100 frames per second on my rig with the settings maxed out at my monitor's native resolution of 1080p and with none of the RTX stuff enabled because I simply can't use that on a GTX card. And while there were occasional moments where the game would hitch up for a split second, and I'm really not sure what caused that, I really can't think of any point where the frame rate dipped below 80 FPS or so. It is legitimately impressive just how well optimized this game is, especially considering how small the development team is, if it's even a team at all. Again, it may just be that one guy. And for whatever reason, a lot of developers seem to have a really hard time optimizing Unreal Engine 4, so at the very least, kudos to the developer for that. All that said, they still did commit that cardinal sin of visual design, where the visuals actually start interfering with your ability to play the game. And while you can muddle through that, it can result in some unnecessary frustration. Then you move over into sound design, and that's where things get a bit iffier. It's got a pretty solid soundtrack that sounds like it could have come out of an epic Chinese action film. And while the gun and explosion sounds certainly aren't as punchy as I'd really like, they're pretty decent too. They certainly get the job done and get it done reasonably well. But then there's the voice acting, and it defaulted to English, which was pretty rough. It wasn't terrible, but it was rather amateurish in a lot of ways. There really weren't very good tones on some of the lines being said, and it just started to bother me almost immediately, so I pretty much immediately switched it over to the Chinese voice acting. But even though that certainly fit the game better, it still felt off, and I think that is just due to the quality of the voice acting being pretty rough across the board. Now, admittedly, I don't speak Chinese, so I don't get the exact nature of the voice acting's quality in Chinese, but the English was pretty rough, and the Chinese voice acting just sounds off compared to the Chinese dramas and action movies and such that I've seen over the years. Obviously, your mileage is going to vary on that, and especially if you speak Chinese fluently, then you'll be able to ascertain whether the voice acting is actually any good or not, compared to me, where I just get the gut feeling because of certain odd tones here and there and such like that. But I did want to go ahead and mention this, considering that the developer is Chinese, and therefore you might want to play this in the native language as far as voice acting goes, but with English subtitles as opposed to playing it entirely in English if you're the kind of person who prefers subs over dubs. Anyway, when you bring all of the presentation together, you do overall end up with something that is rather impressive, although it does still have a few glitches here and there, namely things like the collision detection being a bit wonky sometimes, and it also has some issues with the visuals getting in the way of being able to play the game properly, and then also the issues with the voice acting. So even though it's definitely a very cool first impression, it is pretty rough around the edges. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is that you play as Shelia Tan, an agent of the SRO, who is ordered by her organization's director to go investigate anomalous weather patterns that have cropped up in a nearby area. And along the way, she is informed that the forces of General Lin are also investigating the anomaly, and that they are almost certainly going to come into conflict. When she arrives on scene, she finds that the anomalous weather patterns are because a black hole has opened up in the middle of the sky and is wreaking havoc on the area, and so you do the completely intelligent thing of trying to get closer to it and find out what's going on, and prevent the General's forces from... I don't really know, honestly. And the reason I don't know is quite simple. This game is about 2 hours long, and absolutely nothing is explained. You don't know what the SRO is. Apparently it stands for Science Research Organization or something like that, but it's only ever referred to as the SRO in the game, so not like that matters. You have absolutely no idea why there's a black hole that opened up in the sky. You have absolutely no idea why there's suddenly ancient soldiers popping up that you have to fight. Or more importantly, why they only pop up and get in your way, whereas the General's forces are all way ahead of you and everything else and don't seem to have encountered anything at all that was getting in their way other than you. You have absolutely no idea why the General is there or why he wants what he wants until the very last cutscene, and even then, the explanation is so vapor thin that it might as well not even be there. And then the ending cutscene basically throws everything back to the very beginning of the game and makes you wonder if what you played was supposed to be a dream, or if it's some sort of cycle, or what. Honestly, I have no idea, because the only thing that is actually explained in this game is how to play it. All of the instructions for the tutorials and the various moves you can do and such, those are all explained quite well. But as far as the story, the characters, the motivations of those characters, nothing is explained at all. And the game might get away with it if it weren't a weird mix of sci-fi and fantasy where you have absolutely no frame of reference for anything. So it's best to just treat the story as what it ends up being, which is completely incomprehensible gibberish, and just focus on the gameplay, which is frankly the far more interesting part of it anyway. As I've mentioned before, this is a combination of first-person shooter and a sort of cinematic or character action hack-and-slash kind of thing. Think games like Devil May Cry, where you're trying to build up combos and you're going between guns and swords and things like that. It does lean much more heavily into the first-person shooter side of this, however, and to that end you have a total of 4 main weapons. You have a basic assault rifle, as well as a handgun, which is basically a machine pistol, a sniper rifle, and a shotgun, and each of these has a secondary fire option that uses special ammunition. So for the assault rifle, you get tracking rounds that are basically mini grenades. For the handgun, it shoots an incendiary grenade that explodes on contact. For the shotgun, it shoots out a blast of flame. And then for the sniper rifle, it shoots a sticky grenade that will attach to an enemy and then explode after a period of time. You'll gradually build up your arsenal over time, starting with the assault rifle, then moving to the shotgun, handgun, and sniper rifle. In addition to all of these weapons, you also have access to the light blade, which is a sword, and the exo arm, which is basically like a power gauntlet that allows you to either send out an EMP blast or use it as a grappling hook to start with, and then eventually you can also unlock the ability to do a charging punch with it. Meanwhile, with the sword, not only can you slash with it like you would expect, but you can also use a power attack to launch enemies up into the air and then jump up to start slashing at them repeatedly, and you can also unlock the ability to do a slamming attack on the ground with it to send out a shock wave, as well as an energy wave upgrade that will send out waves of energy whenever you slash to hit enemies from a distance, and you can also use a charge attack with that to send out a more powerful wave of energy, or after you've upgraded that, a whirling death blade that will launch out to a certain position and then just start spinning in that position. Or, once you've fully upgraded it, it will send out that whirling blade, which will then track onto enemies and start flying after them to chop them to ribbons. In addition to all of this, the sword can also be used to block incoming attacks, although it doesn't block everything, and if you time your block correctly, basically right when the attack hits you, then it's basically considered a counter or a parry maneuver, and that will automatically replenish whatever magazine of the weapon that you're currently holding is. So if you have the assault rifle and you're down to 2 rounds, then it will fill up the magazine right back to the maximum size of 40. And then of course, if blocking or parrying the attack is not possible, then you can just dash out of the way with the sideways dash maneuvers. The idea with all of this is to create a very fast-paced and frenetic action game, and for the most part it is successful in doing that. And when you're combining all of these abilities together and just laying waste to your opponents, it can definitely make you feel like a badass. There are a couple of problems with it, however. The first problem is that the blocking and parrying system is fairly inconsistent. I experienced several situations where I would go to block or parry, and what should have been a block or parry just went straight through and ended up doing damage to me anyway, and I really wasn't sure why. Because sometimes it would work, and other times it wouldn't, and I'm not talking about getting hit with an area effect attack and expecting the block to work. I'm talking about direct attacks that I've been able to parry or block before that just don't block or parry for no discernible reason. That certainly got pretty irritating whenever that happened. The next problem is that the boss fights are pretty much just tedious slogs where the enemy has a ludicrous amount of health and you just have to very slowly whittle them down. It's not even necessarily that those fights are difficult. I played through this thing on the hard difficulty setting, and sure, I died a fair few times in the game, but most of the time it was because I would get stuck on something in the environment when trying to dash around, or I would get hit with an attack that shouldn't have gone through my block or parry, but ended up going through anyway, or I would get hit with the very edge of an area effect attack that I thought I had dodged correctly out of, but apparently hadn't. And a good amount of that is because the visuals were actually interfering with my ability to play the game. As I mentioned before, there's just so much stuff flashing on the screen at once that it can be really disorienting during combat, and that can result in a fair number of frustrating and completely unnecessary deaths. The next problem is that while you do have a good number of abilities to work with, and some of those abilities are pretty cool, others don't really work the way the developer probably intends them to, like the charging punch, which I found to be completely useless, not just because you have to spend time charging up the attack before it will actually do anything, but because it also launches you forward in a way that makes it really difficult to actually be accurate with it, and you actually need to be very accurate with it, because if you're not, then you will just miss an enemy entirely even though it looks like you should be able to hit them, and then they just take you down immediately. I mean, sure, the other attacks that require a charge-up time do leave you very vulnerable during that charge-up, but at least they actually have some use. At least the whirling blade that's fully upgraded will track enemies and continually do damage to them. At least the ground slam attack can cause enemies to stagger backwards and does damage in an area around you. The punch, on the other hand, really doesn't have much of a use at all. I also found that the EMP blast and the ability to pull enemies towards you wasn't really all that useful either, because the EMP blast really only works on the lowest tier enemies. For everything else, at best it just staggers them a bit, so you're better off just using other attacks anyway. And upgrading the charged punch and the EMP blast all the way didn't really seem to have all that much of an effect on them either. This, of course, brings me to another issue the game has, which is the upgrade system. You see, in order to upgrade your various special skills as well as your special ammo for your weapons, you need to have reliquaries. These are found either by just wandering around and finding reliquaries stashed in the levels, or by collecting 10 relics, which are the blue orbs you'll occasionally see flying around, in which case those will give you a reliquary per 10 relics. The thing is, most of these improvements are really just percentage increases in the power of something, and honestly I really didn't notice all that much of a difference with most of the upgrades as I went through the game. Some of those upgrades do certainly change the abilities to a significant degree, like the Whirling Blade power-up for the energy blades that you can shoot out with your light blade. But most of the time the upgrade system really just feels like they included it out of feeling it was necessary more than anything else. Like they just looked at AAA design trends, saw that a lot of games out there use upgrade systems, and said, you know what, those other games are doing it, we should do it in this thing too, even though it doesn't really work out all that well. And speaking of things they threw into the game that really don't work very well, there's a vehicle section that allows you to drive what is called an assault vehicle, but it's basically just a car with a turret mounted on it. And there's also a mandatory stealth section, which thankfully doesn't fail immediately if you're spotted, but the enemy just guns you down like it's nothing. And both of those just feel very out of place. Like they looked at AAA design trends, saw that a lot of them have mandatory stealth sections and a lot of them have driving sections, and said, well, if the AAA games are doing it, then we've got to do it in this thing too. Even though neither of these things belong here, especially not the stealth section where you're trying to sneak around and do stealth takedowns with a meat cleaver, because for some utterly baffling reason, none of your guns work and your light blade and exosuit are disabled as well. I can understand the exosuit and the light blade because there's some sort of EMP kind of thing going on there, but why don't the guns work? And more importantly, why do the enemy's guns work, but yours don't? Because thankfully, if you're spotted during that mandatory stealth sequence, you're not immediately failed. It doesn't give you some game over message or anything. But the enemy starts gunning you down and you drop like a sack of potatoes almost instantly, so it might as well be an instant fail sequence. And while I was able to get out of some sequences occasionally where I would get spotted, it was still an incredibly frustrating mess, especially considering that, for some utterly baffling reason, one of the melee takedown animations with this meat cleaver is to just strangle an enemy with it. Because clearly the intelligent thing to do with a meat cleaver, a large, heavy, chopping blade, is to use the completely blunt spine of it to choke an enemy out, because that makes perfect sense. I don't know why they did it this way. I mean, at least the worst thing about the driving section is just that the controls aren't particularly good, so the car tends to kind of float around a bit, and it's hard to target things with it. But you can get through that sequence without too much trouble. The stealth sequence, on the other hand, is just awful. And when you bring the whole game together, you end up with something that is ridiculously short at about 2 hours long, and most of the time it's really not firing on all cylinders, so it's really not all that fun either, which is really unfortunate, because when everything is firing on all cylinders and the combat really works, the game is actually a lot of fun, but it's ridiculously short. The boss fights are really dull. The combat mechanics themselves are a bit glitchy and inconsistent. The driving section is just weak, and the stealth section is downright awful, and what you end up with when you bring it all together is something that really doesn't feel like a full finished game. It feels more like a glorified lengthened tech demo than anything else. And they're charging $20 US for it. But not only are they charging $20 US for what is basically a 2-hour-long tech demo, they're also selling DLC in the form of some character skins, which you're not going to be seeing for most of the game. It's really only going to pop up in cutscenes, so there's really not much point to them. And to make matters worse, once you've finished the main campaign, that's it. There's nothing else to do. You can play through the main campaign again on a different difficulty setting, and there is a 4th difficulty setting that unlocks after you finish the campaign, but there are no extra modes, no multiplayer of any kind certainly, but even in single player, you've just got the campaign, and even if you play through it again, you're still going to be experiencing the same exact thing you experienced when you played through the campaign once, which is that some of it is pretty fun and works really well. And then the rest of it is just a bit iffy, or is downright awful, or is somewhere in between those. And that's a real shame because, like I said, when everything is firing on all cylinders, the combat loop in this game can be very fun. But the game's just so short that you really don't get a chance to enjoy it. And as such, I really can't give this thing anything higher than a 2.5 out of 5. And that's really sad because it's got a lot of potential. If this were polished a bit more, if the mechanics were more properly implemented, if it actually had a story that was comprehensible, and if it had a campaign that was longer than 2 hours, maybe it would turn into something I can recommend. But as it stands, I really can't recommend Bright Memory Infinite unless you get it on sale for a really deep discount. Hopefully this is just the initial bump that the developer is going through, and whenever they end up bringing us something else, it ends up being a much more complete experience with more refined mechanics, and of course a comprehensible story if it happens to be a story-driven game. But we'll just have to wait and see on that. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like the kind of videos I make, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting more games for review, or replacing broken equipment, or getting new equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that is perfectly fine, I understand. But the option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, I hope you all enjoy the rest of Request Month 2022, and I'll see you all in later videos.